Fisherman found huge nets stuck underwater, pulled it up and froze in shock. The morning mist hung over Chesapeake Bay like a gray blanket, and Dale Henley preferred it that way. At 63, he had grown to love the silence that came with the fog. No tourists, no speedboats, just him and the water that had become his only companion since Martha passed 10 years ago. Dale's weathered hands gripped the rim of his small fishing boat as he checked his crab nets for the third time that week. The season had been disappointing so far, with catches barely covering his fuel costs, but he wasn't fishing for the money anymore. The routine kept him sane, kept him from rattling around his empty house like a ghost. He pulled up to the first marker, a red buoy bobbing innocently on the surface. Something felt wrong immediately. The line was heavier than it should be, and when he tried to haul it up, it barely budged. Dale frowned, his salt and pepper beard catching droplets of moisture from the humid air. "Come on, you stubborn thing," he muttered, wrapping the rope around his forearms and putting his back into it. The net came up slowly, fighting him every inch. Dale had been crabbing these waters for over 40 years, first with his father as a boy, then on his own, and later with Martha riding along on Sunday mornings with a thermos of coffee and her crossword puzzles. He knew the difference between a net full of crabs and a net caught on something it shouldn't be. As the mass broke the surface, Dale's stomach dropped. Tangled in his net was something large and dark, covered in barnacles and seaweed. At first glance, it looked like driftwood or maybe part of an old dock that had broken free during a storm. But as he maneuvered it closer to the boat, he could see the unmistakable shape of a suitcase. "Well, I'll be damned," Dale whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of waves against his boat. The suitcase was old, that much was obvious. The leather was waterlogged and stained black, with barnacles clustered along its edges like tiny white flowers. Thick strands of seaweed hung from the handle, and the metal clasps were green with corrosion. Dale had seen plenty of trash pulled up from the bay over the years, shopping carts, car parts, even a motorcycle once, but something about this felt different. He wrestled the suitcase into his boat, water streaming from it onto the deck. It was heavier than he expected, making a sloshing sound when he moved it. Dale stared at it for a long moment, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Every instinct told him to throw it back, to pretend he'd never seen it. Nothing good came from the things the bay gave back. But curiosity had always been Dale's weakness. Martha used to tease him about it, saying he was like a cat in that regard, always poking his nose where it didn't belong. "It's going to get you in trouble one day," she'd warned him with a smile. The fog was starting to lift, and Dale could see the shoreline more clearly now. He should head back, call the Coast Guard, let them deal with whatever this was. But his hands were already working at the corroded clasps, his fingers surprisingly steady despite the chill in the air. The first clasp gave way with a metallic screech that made him wince. The second took more effort, but finally popped open with a sound like a gunshot in the morning quiet. Dale took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The smell hit him first, not the expected stench of decay, but something else. Something sweet and floral, like old perfume mixed with salt water. Inside the suitcase, wrapped in what looked like plastic sheeting, was a wedding dress. Dale's hands trembled as he carefully lifted the dress from the suitcase. Despite being underwater for who knew how long, it was remarkably well preserved. The white silk had yellowed slightly, but the intricate beadwork along the bodice still caught the light. Lace sleeves extended from the shoulders, delicate as spider webs. Beneath the dress, he found a bouquet, or what was left of one. The flowers had long since decayed into brown, papery fragments, but the ribbon holding them together was still intact. A faded blue ribbon with silver edges. But it was what he found at the bottom of the suitcase that made Dale's blood run cold. Wrapped carefully in more plastic, nestled among the folds of what looked like a slip or petticoat, were human bones. Small bones, delicate ones. Dale didn't need to be a doctor to recognize a human hand when he saw one. The bones were clean, picked white by fish and time, but unmistakably human. "Jesus Christ!" Dale breathed, stumbling backward and nearly falling over his tackle box. His first instinct was to slam the lid shut, to pretend this had never happened. But something caught his eye, embroidery along the neckline of the dress. He leaned closer, squinting at the delicate stitching. There, in elegant script, were the initials, L.J., followed by a date. June 15, 1997. Dale sat heavily on his boat's bench, staring at the open suitcase. Someone's wedding dress. Someone's bones. Someone who was supposed to get married on June 15, 1997, but never made it to the altar. 27 years. That's how long this suitcase had been sitting on the bottom of Chesapeake Bay, waiting for someone like him to find it. 27 years of secrets. 27 years of questions that no one had been able to answer. Dale looked around the bay, suddenly feeling very alone despite being only a few hundred yards from shore. The morning that had started like any other had just become something else entirely. Something that would change everything. He pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands, then hesitated. Once he made this call, there would be no going back. Police, investigations, questions he couldn't answer. His quiet life would be turned upside down. But somewhere, someone had been waiting 27 years for answers. Someone had been wondering what happened to LJ, wondering if she was still alive somewhere, wondering if she had just run away or if something terrible had happened to her. Dale looked at the dress again, at the careful embroidery, at the love and hope that had gone into preparing for a wedding day that never came. He thought about Martha, about their own wedding 42 years ago, about the joy on her face as she walked down the aisle toward him. LJ had never gotten that chance. He dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Dale Henley, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm out on Chesapeake Bay, and I just pulled up something in my crab net that I think you need to see. I think I found someone who's been missing for a very long time. As he waited for the Coast Guard to arrive, Dale carefully covered the suitcase with a tarp from his boat. But he couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had owned that dress, who had planned a wedding, who had ended up at the bottom of the bay instead of walking down an aisle. The fog had completely lifted now, and the morning sun was beginning to burn off the last of the mist. It was going to be a beautiful day. But for Dale, and for LJ, wherever she was now, this was just the beginning. That evening, as Dale sat in his small kitchen watching the local news, he wasn't surprised to see his own face staring back at him from the television screen. The reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and too much makeup, was standing on the dock where he kept his boat. The Discovery has reopened a decades-old missing persons case, she was saying. Police confirm that the remains and personal effects found today may be connected to the disappearance of 23-year-old Lillian James, who vanished without a trace just 4 days before her scheduled wedding in June of 1997. Dale turned up the volume, his coffee growing cold in his hands. So LJ was Lillian James. And now, 27 years later, she was finally coming home. Dale couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lillian James's wedding dress, the delicate lace sleeves floating in the dark water of his memory. By 5 a.m, he gave up trying and drove to the Easton Public Library, waiting in his truck until they opened at 9. The librarian, a stern woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked suspicious when he asked about old newspaper archives. "You're not one of those true crime bloggers, are you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "We've had 3 of them already this morning." "No, ma'am," Dale said quietly. "I just want to understand what happened to her." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she led him to a dusty corner where an ancient microfilm machine sat like a relic from another era. "June 1997, she said, threading the film with practiced efficiency. "You'll want to start with the 10th. That's when the story first broke." The first headline made Dale's chest tighten. "Local woman missing days before wedding." Below it was a photograph that took his breath away. Lillian James had been beautiful, not in the polished way of magazine models, but in something more genuine. Dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her smile seemed to light up the grainy newspaper photo. She looked happy, like someone who had her whole life ahead of her. Dale read the article slowly, absorbing every detail. Lillian James, 23, employed at Eastern Shore Bank, had disappeared on June 11, 1997. She had left her apartment that evening, telling her roommate she was going for a walk to clear her head before the wedding. She never returned. Her car was found the next morning in the parking lot of a waterfront restaurant, keys still in the ignition. The wedding, scheduled for June 15 at St. Michael's Church, was quietly cancelled. The article mentioned that the groom, Mark Rutledge, age 26, was cooperating fully with police but had no comment for the press. Dale scrolled through more articles from the following weeks. The search efforts were extensive. Volunteers combed the beaches, divers searched the bay, helicopters swept the shoreline. But as weeks turned to months, the coverage dwindled. The last article he found was dated September 1997. James' family offers $25,000 reward for information. But it was a smaller article, buried on page 6 of the July 2nd edition, that caught Dale's attention. Missing woman's fiancé leaves town. The brief piece mentioned that Mark Rutledge had resigned from his position at a local construction company and moved away. Family friends said he was devastated by Lillian's disappearance and needed a fresh start. Dale leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Something about the timeline bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. He made copies of the most important articles and headed out into the bright afternoon sunshine, feeling like he was carrying the weight of 27 years of unanswered questions. He found himself driving toward downtown, past the tourist shops and seafood restaurants, until he spotted it. Marianne's Cafe. The sign was hand-painted in cheerful yellow letters, with small flowers decorating the edges. According to one of the newspaper articles, Marianne Fletcher had been Lillian's best friend since childhood and had organized many of the early search efforts. The cafe was small and cozy, with mismatched chairs and local artwork on the walls. A woman in her 50s stood behind the counter, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked up when Dale entered, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or just the wariness of someone who had been through too much. "You're the fisherman," she said. It wasn't a question. Dale nodded, suddenly feeling awkward. "Dale Henley. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about Lillian James." Marianne was quiet for a long moment, wiping down the same spot on the counter repeatedly. "I've been expecting someone like you," she finally said. 27 years I've been waiting for this day, wondering if she'd ever come home." She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if he wanted any, then led him to a corner table away from the handful of other customers. Her hands shook slightly as she sat down. "Lily was my best friend," Marianne began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We grew up together, went to school together, told each other everything. Or so I thought." "What do you mean?" Marianne stared into her coffee cup. "The weeks before the wedding, she was different. Nervous, but not the good kind of nervous a bride should be. She kept saying she felt trapped, like she was making a mistake. But every time I tried to talk to her about it, she changed the subject. Did she want to call off the wedding? I don't know. Maybe. She loved Mark, I know she did. But there was something else, something she wouldn't tell me." Marianne looked up at Dale, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The night before she disappeared, she called me. Said she needed to talk, that she had something important to tell me. We were supposed to meet for breakfast the next morning, but she never showed up." Dale felt a chill run down his spine. "Did she say what she wanted to talk about?" "No, but she sounded scared. Really scared." Marianne dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "I should have insisted she tell me right then. Maybe if I had." "You can't blame yourself," Dale said gently. "Can't I?" Marianne's voice cracked. "My best friend needed help, and I told her to get some sleep and that we'd talk in the morning. There was no morning for Lily." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 27 years of guilt and grief settling between them like a physical presence. "There's something else," Marianne said finally. "Something I never told the police because I wasn't sure it mattered. But now..." Dale leaned forward. "What is it?" Lily's family. They weren't exactly thrilled about the wedding. Her stepfather especially. He thought Mark wasn't good enough for her, said he was just after her money. And her mother? Marianne shook her head. She was more worried about what people would think than about what Lily wanted. Money? Lily's family had money. Old money. Her stepfather owned half the businesses in town, and her mother came from one of those Eastern Shore families that traced their lineage back to the Mayflower. They expected Lily to marry someone from their social circle, not a construction worker, no matter how much she loved him. Dale thought about the wedding dress, the expensive beadwork, the careful embroidery. A dress that cost more than most people made in a year. I think, Marianne said quietly, that Lily was planning to run away. The next morning, Marianne picked up Dale in her faded blue Honda, a thermos of coffee and a box of tissues on the dashboard. She had barely slept, she told him, thinking about Lillian for the first time in years without the usual wall of protective numbness. I used to drive out there sometimes, she said as they headed toward the outskirts of town. Especially on her birthday. Just to sit in the driveway and remember her. But I haven't been back in 5 years. Too painful. The James family summer house sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked out most of the morning sun. It had once been grand, a sprawling Victorian with wraparound porches and ornate gingerbread trim. Now it looked like something from a ghost story, with peeling paint, broken shutters, and weeds growing through the porch boards. Lily loved this place, Marianne said softly as they walked up the cracked walkway. She used to say it was the only place she felt truly free. Her stepfather never came out here, said it was too rustic for his taste. Dale tried the front door, surprised when it opened with just a gentle push. Shouldn't this be locked? The family put it up for sale years ago, but nobody wants to buy it. Too much upkeep, and the locals. Marianne trailed off. Well, everybody knows what happened. Or what didn't happen. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through dirty windows. Furniture sat covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and family photographs still hung on the walls, their subjects smiling out from behind cracked glass. Lily's room was upstairs, Marianne whispered, though there was no one around to overhear. Third door on the right. They climbed the creaking staircase, their footsteps echoing in the empty house. Dale felt like an intruder, but Marianne seemed to know exactly where she was going. She pushed open a door at the end of the hallway, and suddenly they were standing in what had clearly been a young woman's sanctuary. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt alive somehow. A four-poster bed sat against one wall, still made up with a faded quilt. Books lined the shelves, poetry, romance novels, a few college textbooks. A vanity table held perfume bottles and jewelry boxes, everything covered in a thick layer of dust but otherwise untouched. Her mother couldn't bear to pack it up, Marianne explained. After the stepfather died, she just locked the house and walked away. Dale moved carefully around the room, feeling like he was walking through a museum exhibit. On the desk by the window, he found a stack of wedding magazines, bookmarked pages showing different hairstyles and flower arrangements. Next to them sat a leather-bound planner, open to June 1997. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the final entry. Written in neat handwriting was, "Final dress fitting 2 p.m. Dinner with M's parents 7 p.m. But someone had drawn heavy black lines through both appointments. Marianne peered over his shoulder. She cancelled everything that last day. I remember wondering why she missed the fitting, she'd been so excited about that dress. Dale turned the page, but the rest of the planner was blank. What about her dresser? Did she keep a diary or anything like that? They searched through the drawers systematically. Most contained the usual things: clothes, accessories, old letters from college friends. But when Marianne pulled out the bottom drawer of the vanity, she frowned. "This doesn't sit right," she said, running her fingers along the edges. "It's too shallow." Dale knelt beside her, examining the drawer more closely. Sure enough, there was a gap between the bottom of the drawer and the floor of the vanity. He pressed along the edges until he heard a soft click, and a hidden panel slid away. Inside was a small leather journal, bound with a ribbon. Marianne's hands trembled as she opened it. The entries were dated, starting in March 1997. Dale read over her shoulder as she flipped through the pages, watching Lillian's thoughts unfold like a flower opening in reverse. March 15th. Mark proposed today. I said yes, of course, but Mother's reaction. Are you sure he's right for our family, dear? Why can't she just be happy for me? April 2nd. Stepfather called Mark that construction boy again today. I hate how he says it, like Mark is beneath us. But Mark has more integrity in his little finger than stepfather has in his whole body. April 20th. Mother wants to invite 300 people to the wedding. I want something small, intimate. But it's not really about what I want, is it? It's about appearances. May 10th. Had another fight with stepfather about the prenup. He doesn't trust Mark, says he's only marrying me for the money. How can he think so little of me? Of my judgment? May 25th. Mark and I talked about eloping. Part of me wants to run away to Vegas and just do it, forget about all this drama. But then I think about disappointing everyone. The entries grew more distressed as the wedding date approached. Dale could feel the pressure building through Lillian's words, the weight of expectations crushing down on a young woman who just wanted to marry the man she loved. June 8th. 3 days until the wedding. I can't eat, can't sleep. Mother keeps asking if I'm having second thoughts, and maybe I am. Not about Mark, never about Mark. But about everything else. The money, the expectations, the way they look at him like he's not good enough. June 10th. I've made my decision. I can't go through with this charade. Mark and I are going to leave tomorrow night after the rehearsal dinner. We'll drive to Maryland, get married at a courthouse, and start fresh somewhere new. I've already packed a bag and hidden it in the boathouse. By the time they realize we're gone, we'll be long gone. Marianne gasped. She was going to elope. But it was the final entry, dated June 11th, that made Dale's blood run cold. Something's wrong. Stepfather knows about our plan, I'm sure of it. The way he looked at me at dinner tonight, like he was seeing right through me. And Mother kept asking strange questions about where I was going after dinner. I think Eliza might have been listening at my door last night when Mark and I were making plans. I'm scared, but I have to follow through. I'm meeting Mark at the bay at midnight. If anything happens to me, it won't be by my own choice. I pray we make it out of here safely. I just want to be free. The room fell silent except for the sound of Marianne's quiet crying. Dale stared at the journal entry, his mind racing. Lillian had been planning to run away with Mark, but someone in her family had found out. And now she was finished. We need to find Mark Rutledge, Dale said quietly. Marianne looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Do you think he knows what really happened to her? Dale closed the journal carefully, handling it like the precious evidence it was. I think he's the only one left who might. Finding Mark Rutledge took Dale 3 phone calls and a visit to the county records office. He was living in Cambridge, Maryland, just 2 towns over, close enough to have read about the discovery in the local papers. Dale wondered if that was intentional, or just one of life's cruel coincidences. The address led them to a modest suburban neighborhood where children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and the smell of barbecue drifted from backyards. Mark's house was neat but unremarkable, a small ranch-style home with white siding and black shutters. A silver sedan sat in the driveway next to a red minivan. He has a family now, Marianne observed quietly as they sat in Dale's truck, watching the house. Dale had been thinking the same thing. 27 years was a long time. Long enough to build a new life, to try to forget the old one. He wondered what Mark had told his wife about his past, if anything. They didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3:30, the front door opened and Mark Rutledge stepped out, older and grayer but unmistakably the same man from the newspaper photos. He was followed by 2 young children, a boy and a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, and a woman with short blonde hair who kissed him goodbye before herding the kids toward the minivan. Dale waited until the minivan disappeared around the corner before approaching the house. Mark was checking his mailbox when he looked up and saw them walking up the driveway. For just a moment, his face went completely blank, as if he was seeing ghosts. "Mr. Rutledge?" Dale said. "My name is Dale Henley. I'm the one who found the suitcase." Mark's shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked every one of his 53 years. "I've been expecting this," he said quietly. "Ever since I saw the news. You'd better come inside." The living room was decorated in cheerful colors: yellow walls, family photos, children's artwork taped to the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway. It was the kind of home that spoke of happiness, of people who had moved on from whatever darkness might have existed in their past. Mark offered them coffee, which they declined, then sat heavily in an armchair across from the couch where Dale and Marianne had settled. "I know why you're here," he said without preamble. "You want to know what happened to Lily. The truth is, I've been asking myself that same question for 27 years. We found her journal," Marianne said gently. "She wrote about your plan to elope." Mark's eyes filled with tears. "She told you she was her best friend. Marianne Fletcher, right? She talked about you all the time, how you were the only person who understood her." Marianne nodded, unable to speak. Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "We were going to leave that night. Drive to Elkton, get married at one of those 24-hour chapels, then keep driving until we found somewhere we could start over. Away from her family, away from all the pressure and expectations. But she never showed up," Dale said. "No." Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "I waited at the bay until 3 in the morning. I kept thinking maybe she'd been delayed, maybe her family had caught her trying to leave and there was some kind of scene. But she never came." "What did you do?" "I went to her house. Threw pebbles at her bedroom window like some lovesick teenager. But there were no lights on, no response. So I went home and waited for her to call." Mark wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She never did. The newspaper said she left a note calling off the wedding," Dale said. Mark's laugh was bitter. "That's what her stepfather told everyone. Said she'd left a note saying she couldn't go through with it, that she needed time to think. But I never saw any note. And it didn't sound like Lily. She would have talked to me first, would have explained." "Did you tell the police about your elopement plan?" "Eventually. But by then..." Mark shook his head. "By then I looked like a suspect. The jilted fiancé with a motive. Her stepfather had already painted me as someone who was only after her money, and now here I was claiming we had this secret plan that nobody else knew about. It sounded desperate, even to me." Marianne leaned forward. "But you believed she was coming to meet you that night?" "Absolutely. She was scared of her family's reaction, but she was determined. The last time I talked to her, she said she'd rather die than spend the rest of her life trapped in that gilded cage." Mark's face crumpled. "I never thought. I never imagined she might actually." "You think she finished herself?" Dale asked. "For 27 years, that's what I've tried to believe. That she couldn't face disappointing everyone, couldn't handle the pressure, and just walked into the bay. It was easier than thinking someone might have hurt her." "But you don't really believe that?" Marianne said. Mark met her eyes. "No. I don't. Lily was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for. She wouldn't have given up without a fight. And there's something else, something I never told the police because I wasn't sure it meant anything." Dale felt his pulse quicken. "What?" "The morning after she disappeared, I drove by her house. I was desperate, hoping maybe she'd come home, that there was some explanation. But I saw her stepfather in the driveway, loading something into the trunk of his car. Something heavy, wrapped in a tarp." The room fell silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. "I convinced myself it was nothing," Mark continued. "Pool equipment, maybe, or lawn furniture. But the way he looked around before closing the trunk, like he was making sure nobody was watching." "Why didn't you tell the police?" Dale asked. "Because 2 days later, he was finished. Car accident on Route 50. Drove straight into a tree, no skid marks, no explanation. And I thought, what if he couldn't live with what he'd done? What if that was his confession? Mark buried his face in his hands. I should have fought harder to find her. Should have demanded answers. But I was 26 years old and terrified, and her family had money and connections and lawyers. They made it clear I wasn't welcome in their grief. So I left town, tried to build a new life, tried to forget. But you couldn't, Marianne said softly. Never. Not a day goes by that I don't think about her, don't wonder what really happened that night. And now, he looked up at Dale. Now you've found her dress, her bones. She's been down there all this time, waiting for someone to care enough to bring her home. Dale stood up, his mind racing with new possibilities. If Mark was telling the truth, then Lillian's stepfather might have been involved in her disappearance. But the man was long finished, taking his secrets with him. There's one more thing, Mark said as they prepared to leave. Lily had a younger sister, Eliza. She was about 15 then, worshipped the ground Lily walked on. If anyone knew what happened that night, it would be her. But after the stepfather died, the family scattered. I have no idea where she ended up. Dale shook Mark's hand at the door, surprised by the strength of the other man's grip. Find out what happened to her, Mark said quietly. She deserves that much. We all do. Finding Eliza James took longer than finding Mark had. She'd married twice, changed her name both times, and seemed to have spent the last 27 years trying to disappear from her past as completely as possible. It was Marianne who finally tracked her down through a mutual friend from high school who worked at the post office. Eliza Morrison now, Marianne told Dale as they drove toward the small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Lives alone, works as a night shift nurse at the hospital. Nancy said she's become something of a hermit over the years. The apartment building was one of those anonymous brick structures that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and forgotten about ever since. Eliza lived on the third floor, in a unit that overlooked the parking lot. Dale knocked softly, aware that it was only 2 in the afternoon, and she might be sleeping after working all night. The woman who answered the door bore only a faint resemblance to the teenage girl in the old family photos they'd seen at the summer house. Eliza was thin to the point of goneness, with graying brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than just working night shifts. "You're here about Lily," she said before either of them could introduce themselves. It wasn't a question. Dale nodded. "I'm Dale Henley. I know who you are." Eliza stepped back from the door, but didn't invite them in. "I saw you on the news. I've been waiting for this conversation for 27 years. May we come in?" Marianne asked gently. Eliza hesitated, then opened the door wider. Her apartment was sparse and clean, almost antiseptic. No photographs, no personal touches, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived there. It felt more like a hiding place than a home. "I don't have much furniture," Eliza said, gesturing toward a small couch and single chair. "I don't entertain." They sat in awkward silence for a moment. Dale could see that Eliza was trembling slightly, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "We've been trying to piece together what happened to Lillian that night," Dale said carefully. "Mark told us about their plan to elope." "Mark." Eliza's voice was bitter. "Always so sure he could save her. He never understood our family, never understood what Lily was up against." "What do you mean?" Marianne asked. Eliza was quiet for so long that Dale wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I followed her that night." Dale felt his heart skip. "You followed Lillian? She thought she was being so clever, sneaking out after everyone was asleep. But I heard her moving around in her room, heard her creeping down the stairs. I was 15 and curious and..." Eliza's voice broke. "I thought it was romantic. My big sister running away with her true love. Where did she go?" Marianne leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Down to the bay, just like she planned. She had a suitcase with her, not very big, Just enough for a few days until she and Mark could figure things out. I hid behind the old pier pilings and watched her wait for him by the water. Dale exchanged glances with Marianne. But Mark never came? Oh, he came, Eliza said, and there was something strange in her voice. But he wasn't alone. The room fell completely silent. Dale could hear his own heartbeat. Our stepfather was with him, Eliza continued. They were arguing, all three of them. I couldn't hear everything from where I was hiding, but I could tell Lily was upset. She kept shaking her head, backing away from them. What were they arguing about? Dale asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew. Money. It was always about money with our stepfather. He'd found out about their plan somehow, probably through me, God help me. I think I talked about it in my sleep or something, because he started asking me strange questions about Lily's behavior. Anyway, he'd cornered Mark earlier that evening, offered him $50,000 to disappear and never contact Lily again. Marianne gasped. Mark took the money? No, Eliza said quickly. That's what they were fighting about. Mark had brought the stepfather to the bay to tell Lily what had happened, to prove that he wasn't after her money. He wanted her to see that he turned down the bribe, that he loved her for herself. Then what happened? Eliza's face crumpled, and suddenly she looked like the frightened 15-year-old she'd been that night. Lily was so angry. Not at Mark, but at our stepfather. She started yelling at him, saying she was an adult and could make her own choices. She said she was tired of him controlling her life, tired of him treating her like property. Dale waited, sensing there was more. Our stepfather grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back toward the house. He was saying something about the family reputation, about how she was going to ruin everything they'd worked for. And Lily. Eliza took a shaky breath. Lily pushed him away hard. She said she'd rather die than live another day under his roof. And then? She turned to run to Mark, but the dock was wet from the evening mist. Her foot slipped, and she fell backward, hit her head on the edge of the pier. Eliza's voice was hollow now, emotionless. I heard the crack from where I was hiding. She went into the water and never came back up. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Dale felt sick. What did you do? Marianne whispered. Nothing, Eliza said, and the self-hatred in her voice was devastating. I was 15 and terrified, and I did nothing. I watched our stepfather and Mark dive into the water, searching for her. I watched them drag her body out 20 minutes later. And I watched our stepfather take charge like he always did. He covered it up, Dale said. Eliza nodded. He said no one would believe it was an accident. Said Mark would be blamed, that the family would be destroyed by scandal. He made Mark help him put Lily in the suitcase with her wedding dress, said she should be buried with dignity, not dragged through a crime investigation. And Mark agreed to this? Mark was in shock. He kept saying it was his fault, that if he hadn't brought the stepfather there, Lily would still be alive. Our stepfather convinced him that keeping quiet was the only way to protect her memory. Dale thought about the weighted suitcase, sitting on the bottom of the bay for 27 years. They threw her in the water. Our stepfather said it was what she would have wanted. To be free. Eliza laughed bitterly. He died 2 days later in that car accident. I always wondered if it really was an accident, or if he couldn't live with what we'd done. What you'd done? Marianne's voice was sharp. You were a child. You were hiding in the dark, watching something terrible happen. That's not your fault. Isn't it? I never told anyone the truth. I let everyone believe she'd run away, let them search for her, let Mark torture himself with guilt. I let my sister stay lost for 27 years because I was too much of a coward to speak up. Eliza finally looked up at them, her eyes red with tears. But she's found now. And maybe she can finally rest. 3 months later, Dale stood in St. Michael's Cemetery on a crisp October morning, watching as a small crowd gathered around a newly installed headstone. The marble was simple but elegant, inscribed with words that Marianne had chosen. Lillian James, beloved daughter and friend, finally free. The funeral had been held the week before, a quiet ceremony that brought together the scattered pieces of Lillian's life. Mark had come with his wife and children, having finally told them the story of his first love and the tragedy that had shaped his life. His wife, a kind woman named Sarah, had surprised everyone by hugging Marianne and saying, "Thank you for bringing her home." Eliza had been there too, looking frail but somehow lighter, as if 27 years of carrying secrets had been lifted from her shoulders. She'd given a eulogy that left not a dry eye in the church, speaking of the sisters she'd idolized and lost, and the guilt that had consumed her life. "I thought keeping her secret would protect her," she'd said, her voice wavering but strong. "But secrets don't protect the deceased. They only poison the living. Lily deserves to be remembered for who she was, a young woman who loved deeply and wanted nothing more than the freedom to choose her own path." Dale had been asked to speak as well, which had surprised him. He wasn't family, barely knew Lillian except through other people's memories. But as he stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had loved her, he understood why they'd asked him. "I never met Lillian James," he'd said. "But I know her story now, and I know that she was loved. Sometimes the Bay gives back what it has taken, but only when it's time. Lillian waited 27 years to come home, and I think maybe that was so she could bring all of you together one more time." Now, standing by her grave, Dale watched as Marianne placed a bouquet of white roses on the fresh earth. She'd aged in the months since the discovery, but she seemed more at peace than when he first met her in the cafe. "She would have loved this," Marianne said softly, gesturing to the headstone. "Simple, honest, no pretense." "Have you heard from the scholarship fund?" Dale asked. Marianne's face brightened slightly. "We've raised almost $30,000 so far. Enough to help a dozen young women who need to escape difficult situations. The Lillian James Freedom Fund, it has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" Dale nodded. It did seem fitting that Lillian's legacy would be helping other women find the freedom she'd never had. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the leaves fall from the oak trees that lined the cemetery paths. Dale thought about the journey that had brought them here, how a routine morning of crabbing had turned into something so much larger than himself. "Do you ever wonder," Marianne asked suddenly, "if you were meant to find her?" Dale considered the question. "I used to think it was just bad luck, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now..." He paused, looking at Lillian's headstone. "My Martha used to say that the Bay has its own schedule, its own reasons for doing things. Maybe Lillian was waiting for someone who would care enough to find the truth. Someone who understood loss," Marianne added quietly. Dale felt a pang in his chest, thinking of his wife. But for the first time in years, the memory didn't bring only sadness. "Maybe that's it. Maybe you have to know what it's like to lose someone you love before you can understand how important it is to bring them home." As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Dale noticed a familiar figure standing by the gate. Eliza was waiting for them, holding a small wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this," she said to Dale, pressing the package into his hands. "It was Lily's. I kept it all these years, but I think she'd want you to have it." Dale unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a small silver compass, tarnished with age but still functional. The inscription on the back read, "To Lily, may you always find your way home. Love, Grandma Rose." She carried it everywhere, Eliza explained. Said it reminded her that no matter how lost she felt, there was always a way forward. Dale felt his throat tighten. "I can't take this. It should stay in the family." "You are family now," Eliza said firmly. "You brought her home when the rest of us couldn't. That makes you family." Dale pocketed the compass, feeling its weight like a promise. As they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways, he found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. The compass needle pointed north, toward the bay, toward home. That evening, Dale sat on his boat as the sun set over Chesapeake Bay, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. The compass lay in his palm, its needle steady and true. He thought about Lillian, about Martha, about the way the Bay held on to things until it was ready to let them go. Tomorrow he would go crabbing again, pulling up his nets, hoping for a good catch. But he would do it with a different heart than before. The bay had taught him something important, that sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones you're looking for, but the ones that find you when you're ready to receive them. He slipped the compass back into his pocket and started the engine. As his boat cut through the darkening water toward shore, Dale felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, a story completed, a life given meaning. Lillian James was finally free, and in bringing her home, Dale had found his own way back to the living. The bay had kept its promise to both of them, in its own mysterious time and fashion. Behind him, the lights of the town began to twinkle in the growing darkness, welcoming him home.